The storm came in hard and mean, the kind that makes a small town fold into itself. Cedar Valley was all dark porches and shut blinds. In the squad room, the fluorescent lights hummed over a map of the county and a coffee pot that had been working overtime since dusk. Lieutenant Jack Marlowe told himself it was thunder. He said it out loud, just to hear a steady voice in the room. Thunder rattles windows. Thunder lifts dust off old files. Thunder is simple. Shadow did not buy it. The black and tan German shepherd had been stationed by the door since the first crack of lightning. He was not restless. He was deliberate. He would hold a point on the floor like a compass needle, then cut his gaze toward the north window, the one that faced the old Whitford place 2 miles out on Buckner Road. Ears high, breath slow. No showmanship. Just listening. Jack rubbed the scar across his knuckles and watched the dog keep watch. Shadow was 6 now, with a face that had learned how to look through things. He was not the loudest canine in the state, and not the fastest either, but there was a steadiness in him that other handlers stopped by to see. He had a way of filing the world into what mattered and what did not. Tonight, only one thing mattered, and it was somewhere past that window. The wind pushed against the station door and the glass whispered in the frame. The town radio crackled with nothing worth noting. A fender bender cleared itself. A porch light went out and came back. Then the noise came again, tucked inside the storm like a secret. Not thunder, not a branch. A sound too soft to claim the night, but too true to ignore. A small, wet breath pulled through a throat that hurt. Shadow stood before Jack did. The bell on the door chimed. No footsteps outside the glass, just the door drifting open on a gust and settling shut. A white envelope slid across the rubber mat like it had been pushed by the wind, though the wind did not sign its work. No stamp, no name. Jack picked it up by the corner and slit it open with the back edge of his badge. The children still cry beneath her floor. He read it twice, then once more to taste the words. There were towns where a sentence like that would be an ugly prank. Cedar Valley was not one of them. You did not write about children here unless you meant it. Shadow moved to his side, nose lifting to the paper, head tilting a single degree like a man leaning in to hear. Jack set the note on the desk and looked at the clock. 10:16. He checked the rail schedule pinned by a thumbtack next to the coffee maker. The late freight ran at 10 past on Thursdays, shoving a whistle across the valley that could soften a spine. He did not need more. He took the leash off the hook. Shadow pressed his shoulder to Jack's thigh without being told. They were out the door in the next breath, boots on wet steps, the storm giving way like a curtain. Buckner Road ran black and shining, a 2-lane river under a bruised scarf. The cruiser's wipers clacked in impatient rhythm. The Whitford place appeared when the road shouldered left, a white house holding tight to its paint, a barn set back with its roofline bowed under years. Helen Whitford was the kind of woman who made grief lie down and behave. Fundraisers, food drives, children's coats in December. The town had turned her name into a soft place to stand. Shadow did not look at the big house. He locked on the barn and did not blink. Jack parked short of the lane, cut the headlights, and let the engine tick cool. He felt for the small in his back where old pain liked to camp. The rain softened to a spit. The moon gave up nothing. Shadow was statue still, eyes thrown forward, body long, the leash loose in Jack's hand. They walked the ditch line until the hedge broke into a gap. The barn sat with its door angled like a man about to say something and thinking better of it. The yard smelled of wet hay and creosote. In the house, a window light moved, then steadied. Jack put one finger down. Wait. Shadow sank into the mud with his chest and laid his head on his paws, eyes never leaving the door. A porch light snapped on at the house. The front door swung wide. Helen Whitford stepped out with a shawl wrapped tight and a smile already set, the kind made for church lobby greetings. Jack stepped into the open and lifted his badge. "Evening, Mrs. Whitford." "Lieutenant Marlowe." Helen's voice was warm enough to heat a room. "Out in this weather. Got a call about a loose calf." Jack glanced at the fields. "Thought I might have better luck asking than chasing." She laughed, like this was the joke they shared. "No calves loose here, only my nerves. Storms and I never made peace." Behind Jack, Shadow moved. Not forward. Deeper. The dog's chest sank and his muzzle lifted toward the barn like he was smelling memory. The hair along his shoulders rose in a slow line, not like a fight, like a warning. "Is your barn secure tonight, ma'am?" Jack asked it casual, like a neighbor borrowing a ladder. "Safe as any old wood can be." Helen's eyes flicked past him to the dark, then came back with practiced ease. "Why?" "We have a report of kids sneaking into outbuildings to stay dry. Wanted to be sure no one helps themselves and gets hurt. Can I take a look?" She hesitated long enough for the rain to stitch another row across Jack's collar, then she stepped aside and swung the yard gate with a sure hand. "Of course. We always welcome the law." Shadow pulled once. Not hard, just a tug that said, "Time is a thing." Inside the barn, the world changed temperature. The storm went quiet the way a crowd does before a hymn. The air was wood and iron and something else, something like pennies pressed into a child's palm. Shadow broke ahead 3 paces and stopped, front paws planted on a plank near the far wall where the boards had been scrubbed cleaner than the rest. He did not bark. He exhaled a sound low and private, a note meant to be heard by one person. Jack knelt and tapped the plank with the flat of his hand. Hollow pulled back at him. He set his weight on the edge and felt the give that old hinges learn. He looked at Helen. "You keeping a cellar door under here?" Her face did not smile. It remembered how. "We do not have a cellar. My husband filled it in before he passed. Snakes and rot, you know how it is." Shadow slid a paw forward and rested it on the seam. He held Jack's eyes for a beat that felt like a held breath. There was a covenant in that look. "I'm telling you in the only way I can." Jack stood and worked his shoulder, thumb finding the place where leverage liked to live. He had no warrant. He had a note and a dog and a sound that did not care about paperwork. He lifted. The board lifted with him an inch, then 2. The metal ring was there, old and thick and painted by 100 harvests. He hooked it with his fingers and pulled. The door came up with a groan like bone. Cold climbed the ladder of his spine. Helen took 1 step backward, her shoes whispering on the dust. Jack set the door aside and dropped his light into the hole. The beam went down against stone that had not seen sun in generations. The first stair wore a polish that only feet can give. "We will need to go down, Mrs. Whitford. You will do no such thing." The warmth in her voice went out. Her hand tightened on the shawl. "You have no right." Jack felt his jaw find the place it goes when he is done asking. "Ma'am, if there is nothing here, I will be the first to apologize. If there is something, we do not leave it in the dark." Shadow did not wait for permission. He stepped to the mouth and paused like a man finding a prayer, then made the descent, pads careful on old wood. Jack followed, light swinging, one hand on the rail that did not want to hold. The noise of the storm climbed away. The room below met them with a breath that had waited too long. It was small. Stone walls leaning in. A chair bolted to the floor, straps hanging, their leather tired. Chains sleeping against a ring set into the wall, a bucket that should never have been asked to be what it was. The light caught a smear on the stone that used to be red, and had tried to be something else. Shadow crossed the room and placed his body against the far wall, shoulder pressed to stone, ear turned, as if the wall still had something to say. He closed his eyes, opened them, and let a sound rise from his chest that did not belong to fear. It belonged to grief. Jack's throat closed around air. He swung his light back to the stair. Helen was gone. A floorboard popped upstairs. A door hit air. Jack took the stairs 2 at a time, Shadow already clearing them. Outside, the yard gate clicked. Headlights flared at the curve of the drive. A truck coughed and found its throttle. Jack hit the radio. Unit 1. Possible felony scene at Whitford Farm. Suspect Helen Whitford fleeing south on Buckner. Request immediate backup and roadblock at Miller Bridge. Copy. Static. Copy. He ended the call and looked back at the barn. He had expected this night to be about noise, arrests and sirens. The twist landed quiet. The saint in pearls did not argue, did not weep. She ran like a woman who knew exactly which doors creaked and which did not. Shadow moved to the barn threshold and stopped. He would not step out. He planted his feet and held that line as if the world depended on this small piece of ground belonging to him. Jack took 1 step toward the driveway, then looked back. The dog's eyes were fixed past him, past the doorway, past the rain. He was not tracking a truck. He was listening to what the floor still held. Jack walked back and stood beside him. "What do you hear, partner?" Shadow lifted his head, breathed in once, and answered without a sound. It was in the boards. A thin hum that might be a pipe or might be a voice finding a way through wood. Not thunder. Not the wind. A sob trying to be invisible. Jack crouched and pressed his palm to the plank. The night reached up and pressed back. He felt it in the meat of his hand, a tremor smaller than a heartbeat. He stood, pulled his phone, and took 1 picture of the ring in the floor. Not for proof, for memory. Then he dialed the judge who would answer at any hour, because some men sleep light on purpose. Judge Caffrey. Jack kept his voice even. "I'm at Whitford Farm. I have probable cause and exigent circumstances. I'm requesting a warrant to enter and search the outbuildings and substructures now. You have it, Lieutenant." The judge did not ask for the long version. He had lived here long enough to trust the difference between thunder and something else. "I will file the paperwork. Do not wait." Jack ended the call. He rested his hand on Shadow's neck. The dog stayed at the threshold, muscles set, eyes bright. He would not move. Not yet. The barn had chosen him, or he had chosen it, and sometimes that is the same thing. Outside, sirens were waking up the valley. Lights were coming. The storm kept its own counsel over the fields. Jack looked at the dark hole in the floor and the dog who would not leave it. "All right, Shadow, we do it your way." He clicked his light back on and lifted the ring. The door sighed open, and the night gave up another breath that had been waiting, patient and afraid. Shadow stepped forward first, as if he had been born for this room and this hour, and Jack followed him into the place where simple answers end. By daylight, the Whitford place looked like a postcard somebody kept too clean. White paint that never chipped. Hydrangeas the size of dinner plates. A porch swing that creaked the way good memories do. If you drove by slow, you would think kindness could be built with a fresh coat and a picket fence. Jack rolled to a stop at the end of the gravel lane and killed the siren that was not on. He did not announce himself with lights. He never did when he wanted a clean read on a house. Shadow stood in the back seat with his front paws on the console. Quiet, eyes forward. The shepherd had slept little since the storm. He did not look tired. He looked certain. They walked the lane together, Jack to the left, Shadow to the right, keeping a small space that could flex if it had to. The air smelled like rain teased out of the soil and bleach that had been used in a rush. That second smell did not belong to hydrangeas. Helen Whitford stepped out before Jack could raise a hand to knock. She wore a blue sweater and a string of pearls that sat easy on her. Her smile was careful, not brittle. She had the voice of a woman who could calm a room by saying the room was already calm. "Lieutenant Marlowe," she said. "I heard the storm kept you busy." "We managed," Jack answered. Thought I would check on you and the kids. Rough night. We are all fine." She pushed the screen door wider and stood aside so the welcome felt like something you could walk through. "Please, come in out of the wind." Shadow did not cross the threshold. He lifted his nose once and cut left, away from the bright hallway and the smell of lemon oil. He set a line for the yard like he had been invited to a different conversation. "Oh, the dog," Helen said, as if she had just remembered he existed. "Shadow, is it? What a name. He is handsome." Jack watched the shepherd cross the lawn without a sound, tail level, head high. Shadow did not take compliments unless they came in a language his nerves trusted. He locked on the barn as if the building had breathed his name. "We have had kids sneaking into old sheds all over the county," Jack said. "Mind if we walk the grounds? Just want to be sure no one is hiding where they should not be. You keep this town safe, Lieutenant." Helen folded her hands like a prayer that had been finished. "Walk where you like." The yard was neat the way a drawer is neat after somebody needs it to be. Jack took in what Shadow already had, a row of boots by the steps with mud on them where the lawn was dry, trash cans clean enough to eat out of, a coil of rope hung on a nail, rope that had seen hands but no weather. Shadow reached the barn door and stopped. He put his nose to the seam and drew a single long breath, then another. The first ruffle of his hackles came up slow from his shoulders. He pawed the sill once, twice, not frantic, deliberate. He set his right ear toward the interior like he was reading through wood. "Old tools in there," Helen said easily. "Rusty things. Dangerous. Children are not allowed. I keep it locked for a reason." Jack looked at the lock. New brass trying to look old. He pinched the hasp and felt the oil on his fingers. Someone had rubbed dust into the plate to make it agree with the paint. He wiped his thumb on his jeans and said nothing. "We can take a look if you prefer," he said, softening it with a smile he used on parents who did not want to hear their teenager had been picked up after curfew. Helen shook her head, the pearls shifting a fraction. "I'm sure you're a good judge of danger, Lieutenant, but that door sticks, and my insurance is not fond of visits from the city when they did not ask for them. If you have paperwork, I will gladly sign on the line that says I cooperated. Otherwise, I would hate for you to slip and break that strong back of yours." She said it with concern that looked like it belonged to him. Shadow scored the threshold with his nails and sat. He does not sit like other dogs. He makes a square of himself and becomes a measure. He glanced at Jack, held, then put one paw on the plank inside the doorway and left it there like a hand laid on a shoulder. A statement. Here. Jack felt the pull in his chest that all good handlers learn to respect. He also felt the weight of a town that had named a woman a saint and did not enjoy revising scripture. He set 2 fingers gently on Shadow's collar. The dog did not lean back. He did not lean forward. He let his certainty transfer through bone. "Any kids around this morning, ma'am?" Jack kept his eyes on the dog while he asked it. "They are at lessons with Miss Avery in the parlor." Such a gift, that girl. Reads to them from a book about brave horses. "Did you know animals can help children regulate their breathing?" Helen's smile widened a degree. "We are very modern here." Jack let his gaze slide to the house. Through the window he could see small shapes and a flash of a red ribbon and a book held open by hands that shook a little. The parlor had a rug that was too new for the furniture. A boy in a yellow shirt looked up from the rug and saw Shadow at the barn. He did not wave. He did not smile. He set his small palm against the glass and held it there for 2 beats, then turned and placed his other hand flat on the floor near his knee. A whisper of emotion. The kind you make when you're trying not to make one. Jack felt everything inside him go quiet so he could hear one thing at a time. "We can come back with the proper form if that makes you more comfortable," Jack said. He worked his jaw, feeling the stubborn memory of old pain and the new insistence of the dog at his side. "For now, I will make a note. We will check the fencing." Maybe we can reposition your floodlight to discourage any visitors." Helen's relief was quick and well rehearsed. "That sounds sensible. Would you like coffee? I have a pot on." "No, ma'am. Another time." That should have been the end of a polite visit. But Shadow rose and crossed 3 steps to a patch of barn wall where the boards met awkward. He pressed his nose to a hairline crack and breathed out, long and low, fogging the seam. He looked like a man trying to warm glass so he could see through it. Then he took 1 step back and braced, front legs set, chest high, head lowered. The kind of posture you see when a dog decides his body is a wall. Helen's voice softened to something Jack knew better than his own name. "Lieutenant, please call him off. I would hate for him to hurt himself. That wall is not worth a scratch." Jack let the silence sit. He studied the postage stamp corner where the siding met the sill. New nails, scuffed with grit. A cut line that had been painted and wiped before it dried. A faint drag mark in the dirt as if something heavy and square had been pulled and pushed until the ruts made sense. He went to a knee by Shadow and put a hand on the dog's flank. He felt the tight quiver under the coat, not fear, not fight, focus. He leaned in the way he does when he wants Shadow to feel his breath. "Easy, boy." Shadow lowered his head until the fur of his neck pressed the wood. His ears worked, one forward, one turned back to Jack. Listening in 2 directions at once, the plot twist did not arrive with dramatic music or an accusation. It came on the breeze from the far pasture, a single horn blast from a freight train that was not due until night. The sound hung over the fields like an old secret pulled out in the sun. In the parlor, the boy in the yellow shirt flinched and dropped his book. In the barn wall, whatever Shadow heard shifted a fraction. The dog's right paw slid forward and touched the seam as if to say, "I heard you." Helen did not flinch. She watched Jack watching the dog and said, "How unsettling. The mill runs tests sometimes. The tracks are miles from here, but the sound travels." Jack stood. He wanted to pry at the seam with his thumbnail and let the day do what it wanted to do. He wanted to put his shoulder into the door and take whatever came. He also wanted to win this fight the right way, once, without giving anyone room to say he rushed a saint. He put his card in Helen's hand. "We will return this afternoon, ma'am. Please do not let anyone into the outbuildings until I do." "Of course, Lieutenant." He whistled once for Shadow, not because the dog needed a command, but because rituals matter. Shadow came off the wall with reluctance that pushed through his bones. He did not look back. He walked with Jack to the cruiser and leapt into the back seat without touching the door. They drove away under a sky trying to decide what to be. Jack did not turn on the radio. He let the tires talk to the road. After a half-mile, Shadow stood, placed his nose to the window, and let out a single breath that fogged his reflection. Then he sat and pressed his shoulder into the metal cage until it vibrated. Jack pulled into the diner on Main and parked where he could see both the rail schedule in the window and the mouth of Buckner Road. He went in, nodded at the 2 farmers who always stayed for a second coffee, and took the stool by the bulletin board. Shadow followed without being asked, settled at his feet, eyes up. Louise, behind the counter, poured Jack a mug and tipped her chin toward the shepherd. "He looks like he is running a sermon. He is listening." Jack sipped the coffee and tasted iron in an hour that would not be kind. He stared at the rail timetable. Thursday night, 10:14, test pattern in the afternoon if the mill had its way. "You okay, Jack?" Louise asked it the way people ask when they want to help but do not know how. "We will be," he said. The door chimed, and a woman slipped in from the rain with her hood up and her eyes lowered. She held a book that did not fit her and a handbag that did. She paused at the board as if looking for apartment listings and pinned something to the cork without really pinning it. The paper hung by a corner and then let go. It slipped down and landed by Shadow's paw. He did not move. He looked at it and then up at Jack. Jack picked up the scrap. 4 words in a neat hand. Check the second door. He looked up to the woman in the hood, but she was already halfway to the street, the bell marking her exit like a soft alarm. He could have chased her, but some messages work better when you let them keep their shape. Shadow placed his paw over the paper and left it there, the way he had at the barn. He did not bark. He did not need to. The room felt smaller and the day longer. Jack folded the note into his palm and put down a few dollars for coffee he would not finish. On the way out, he paused by the timetable. The mill's test had been crossed out in pencil with a new time scribbled above it. Someone had moved the noise. "We will do it right," Jack told the dog as they stepped into the wet light. "We come back with a key that fits." Shadow glanced north, toward the barn that had refused to let him walk away, and then he looked up at Jack as if to say, "There is a voice under there, and it is running out of words." He climbed into the car and sat tall, a sentry in a moving room, and Jack drove for the courthouse, feeling the town's trust and the dog's insistence pulling him the same direction. The morning after the visit to Whitford Farm broke cold and colorless, a gray sheet drawn tight over Cedar Valley. Jack had not slept much. The image of Shadow pressed against the barn wall and that freight horn cutting through the night kept looping in his head. He had been around enough K9 work to know when a dog was reacting to something real, and Shadow had been locked in like a wire under tension. He stopped at the corner store for coffee before heading to the station. That was where he saw her. Small frame, black hair in a loose braid, hands buried in the sleeves of a too-big sweatshirt. Sophie Lane, 10 years old. Placed at the Whitford orphanage a year ago after her mother overdosed. Jack had seen her name once in a child services file, the kind of file that made you want to slam your fist through a desk. She spotted him first. Her steps slowed, her eyes darted to the street, the storefront, the space behind him. She walked up without a word, close enough that the smell of laundry powder clung to her sweatshirt. Then, with a movement so fast it could have been a nervous twitch, she slipped a folded scrap of paper into the chest pocket of his coat. She didn't wait for him to say anything. She just turned and crossed the street, vanishing into the shadow between 2 buildings. Jack stood there with his coffee cooling in one hand and the paper burning a hole in the other. He unfolded it slowly. 5 words in blocky pencil. "They take us when the train whistles." Jack read it twice, then once more, tasting each word like he might find more between them. The whistle. He knew exactly which one she meant. The Thursday night freight that ran through the valley at 10:14, heading west along the spur that passed less than half a mile from Whitford Farm. Every kid in town grew up hearing it in their sleep. It was background noise to most, but if Sophie had tied that sound to "They take us," it wasn't just a train anymore. Shadow sat at his side, watching him read. The shepherd's ears shifted toward the east, toward the invisible line of those tracks, as if he'd already started mapping the sound. Jack tucked the note inside his wallet and walked back to the cruiser. "We're going to the diner," he told Shadow. The diner was a hub without trying to be. It had a rail schedule pinned up next to the bulletin board where people posted things they didn't want to say out loud. Missing cats, cheap tractors, sometimes a job that paid cash. Jack took a stool at the counter, coffee steaming in front of him. Shadow lay at his boots, head up, eyes alert. Louise, the owner, topped off his mug and leaned in. "You've got that look," she said. "Which one?" Jack asked. "The one you had the week of the Mercer fire," she said, moving down the counter. "The look that says you're listening for something the rest of us can't hear." Jack didn't answer. His eyes were on the rail schedule, the neat grid of times and destinations, the Thursday night freight sitting there like an alibi in plain sight. He thought about the horn he'd heard at Whitford Farm yesterday, hours before any scheduled run. Someone was moving freight off the books. Shadow stood without a sound and walked toward the bulletin board. He didn't sniff the usual things, no interest in the flyers or the notes. He stopped directly beneath the rail schedule and stared at it. Just stared. tail still, ears forward. Then he sat, looking over his shoulder at Jack. People in the diner noticed. A couple of old-timers at the corner booth turned to watch. "That dog pointing something out?" one of them asked. "Maybe," Jack said. He joined Shadow at the board and let his eyes move from the schedule to the narrow space behind it. The board had been moved recently. He could see the faint smear of fresh dust on the wall. A sharp scrape outside cut the moment short. Tires against gravel, too quick for a normal stop. Jack stepped to the window in time to see a white delivery van pulling away from the curb, unmarked except for a smear of mud on the rear doors. It turned east toward Buckner Road, toward Whitford Farm. Jack didn't chase it. Not yet. He didn't have a plate, and chasing without a plan could spook whoever was inside. He went, back to the counter, paid for the coffee, and pocketed a small receipt Louise handed him with a look that said she'd noticed the van, too. Outside, the wind shifted. He could smell diesel faint under the cold. Shadow's nose lifted, catching the same trace, his head turning toward the train line again. For a second, Jack felt the same thing he'd felt last night in the barn, an invisible thread tying the dog to something buried deep. He opened the passenger door for Shadow, who hopped in but didn't settle. He stayed upright, looking out the side window as they rolled through town. When they passed the tracks, he whined low in his throat, a sound Jack had only heard on cases that went bad fast. Jack slowed and looked both ways down the line. Empty steel stretching into the distance, but the rails hummed faintly under the tires of the crossing. Something had passed recently, too recent to be on schedule. Back at the station, Jack pinned Sophie's note to the wall above his desk. The words stared back at him, and behind them was her face. The way she'd slipped the paper into his pocket without looking up, the urgency packed into the smallest gesture. Shadow settled by the desk but kept glancing toward the window, toward the north. Jack knew the dog well enough to read it. Something's moving out there, and it's not done. He pulled a county map and traced the rail spur from the main line to the farm, marking the road crossings, the blind curves, the stretches hidden by trees. If Sophie was right, if the whistle was the trigger, then Thursday night was no longer just Thursday night. It was a deadline. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, a single strike like a gavel. Jack looked down at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're going to be there when it blows." The warrant came through just after dawn. Judge Caffrey's voice had been flat on the phone, the way it gets when a man doesn't like what he suspects he's about to authorize. "You have until sundown, Lieutenant. Make it count." By the time Jack turned onto Buckner Road, the clouds were pressing low and the barn roof was just a dark seam on the horizon. Shadow stood in the back seat, weight braced, tail still. He knew where they were going. Helen Whitford was waiting at the porch in a pressed blouse and fresh lipstick, a porcelain coffee mug in her hand. If she was surprised to see the marked cruiser roll up, she didn't show it. Her eyes flicked to the paper Jack carried. "This is official," Jack said, stepping onto the porch and handing her the folded document. "Inspection order, signed by Judge Caffrey. We'll need full access to the property, all structures included." Helen's smile thinned but didn't break. "Of course," she said, her tone syrup-sweet. "Always happy to cooperate." She held the door wide. Jack let her lead. Shadow padded behind, head swinging from side to side, cataloging scents the way some people take photographs. Helen took them through the main house first, parlor, kitchen, bedrooms, her voice filling the air with harmless chatter about fresh paint and children's art projects. But the chatter slipped a little when Jack said, "Let's see the barn." They crossed the yard. The grass still carried the damp from last night's frost. Helen's stride slowed just enough for Jack to notice. She unlocked the barn with a practiced motion, the key turning too quickly in a lock that had been oiled recently. The door groaned open, light spilled across the packed dirt floor. Shadow didn't hesitate. He went straight to the far corner, the exact patch of boards he'd chosen before. 3 sharp barks broke the stillness, each one echoing off the rafters like a judge's gavel. Helen flinched. "It's just storage," she said quickly. "Old tools, things with rust and splinters, dangerous for children." Jack was already moving. "Then it's dangerous for all of us," he said. He crouched beside Shadow, sweeping aside a thin layer of straw. His fingers caught on something solid. Cold metal. He brushed away the rest and saw the iron ring, half buried, scarred by time and orange with rust. Helen took a half-step back. "That's nothing." Jack slid a pry bar from his belt. "Then you won't mind if I check?" The wood resisted, groaning under the leverage, but the board lifted. A damp, stale breath pushed up from below, smelling of stone, rot, and something older. The ring was fixed to a square panel, the edges worn smooth from use. Shadow's body went rigid, his ears pressed forward, nostrils flaring. He lowered his head until his nose almost touched the gap and let out a sound Jack had heard only twice before. A low, grief-heavy growl, meant for no one but him. Jack met Helen's eyes. The smile was gone now, replaced by something tight and watchful. "What's down there?" he asked. She didn't answer. He hooked the ring and pulled. The trap door came up slow, as if the barn itself was reluctant to give it up. Darkness yawned below, swallowing the weak daylight in seconds. The first few steps of a wooden stairwell disappeared into shadow. A cold draft rose, brushing Jack's face like a hand from another time. Shadow leaned over the opening, ears twitching, listening to whatever the dark was holding. "Ma'am, I'll need you to wait outside," Jack said without looking at her. Helen's shoes scraped the dirt, but she didn't move toward the door. "Lieutenant, I think you're making a mistake." "Maybe," Jack said, "but I'm not making it alone." He tapped Shadow's flank. The shepherd moved to the edge, eyes locked on the black below, muscles coiled. For a heartbeat, the barn was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Then, somewhere deep in that darkness, Jack thought he heard it. A muffled shift, like metal against stone. It was faint, almost a suggestion, but Shadow's reaction left no doubt. His tail stiffened, his head dropped, and he gave one short, sharp bark. Jack's grip on the flashlight tightened. "All right, partner," he murmured. "Let's see what's waiting for us." And together, man and dog stepped toward the hole in the floor, into the air that smelled of secrets. The first step down was soft with rot. Jack kept one hand on the wall, the other on his flashlight. Shadow went ahead of him, silent but sure-footed, his nails clicking lightly against the wood as if counting the distance to the bottom. The air thickened with each step, damp and sour. It clung to the back of Jack's throat. The beam from his flashlight shook against stone walls that closed in tight, beads of moisture glistening like cold sweat. When they reached the bottom, the space opened into a room no bigger than a garden shed. It was bare, except for the chair. The metal frame was bolted into the floor, leather straps dangling from its arms like discarded snakes. The buckles were tarnished, but the holes in the leather were worn and darkened where they'd been pulled tight too many times. Shadow sniffed once, then recoiled slightly, his ears folding back. Jack's light tracked across the wall. Rusty chain links hung from a ring set deep into the stone. The chain sagged now, lifeless, but near the end where a shackle would have been, there was a faint smear, brown-red, flaking at the edges. Blood. Old enough to be dry, young enough to still hold its color in places. The smell was worse here. Mildew layered over something metallic, human. It was the kind of smell that lived in memory long after you'd left the room. Shadow moved methodically, nose to the dirt floor, tracing invisible lines. He paused near the far corner, stood still, and just listened. Jack turned off the light for a moment. In the dark, he could hear it, tiny drips somewhere beyond the wall, and something else. A faint hum? No, a vibration. too subtle to be mechanical, too steady to be chance. Shadow's ears twitched toward it, then he glanced back at Jack, the question clear. "We'll get there," Jack murmured. They climbed back up, the stairs groaning under their weight. The light from above widened as they neared the opening. Jack's first thought was how quiet it was up there. No shuffle of Helen's shoes, no breath, no movement at all. He stepped into the barn and found it empty. The yard gate was open, swaying lightly on its hinges. Tire tracks cut across the damp grass toward the road. No sign of a car. Jack cursed under his breath and keyed his shoulder mic. "Unit 1 to dispatch. I need a bolo for Helen Whitford, female, mid-60s, white sweater, pearls, driving a silver 09 Ford Expedition. Left the property during active investigation. Possible flight risk." The radio crackled back with acknowledgement. Jack lowered the mic but didn't release it fully. "And keep this off the public channel. Secure line only." He walked to the cruiser with Shadow at his side. The shepherd's eyes kept darting toward the barn as if reluctant to leave it unguarded. Jack understood. Once a dog like Shadow marked a place, it stayed with him. Back at the station, Jack closed the door to his office and made the call to Captain Reese. He kept his report tight, what they'd found in the basement, Helen's disappearance, and his recommendation to bring in the state investigative unit. "Sit on it for now," Reese said. "Last thing we need is half the county showing up with pitchforks and phone cameras." "Too late for quiet," Jack replied. "You know how fast this town talks." And he was right. By mid-afternoon, whispers were moving through Cedar Valley like wind through dry grass. Someone at the feed store claimed Helen had been seen loading boxes into her SUV before dawn. The clerk at the gas station swore she'd paid cash for a full tank and a map of West Virginia. At the elementary school, teachers noticed Sophie Lane's seat was empty. No call from a guardian, no note, just gone. Jack heard about it from Louise at the diner, who leaned over his booth and said, "That little girl you talked to yesterday didn't show for class. Her foster file says she's still in Helen's custody." Shadow, lying under the table, lifted his head at Sophie's name. His eyes sharpened and his body tensed as though ready to stand. Jack reached down and rested his hand against the dog's shoulder. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." It wasn't proof yet. Not enough for an arrest warrant. But it was the first truth, ugly and solid. What they'd seen in that basement wasn't an accident of history. It was now. It was happening. And Helen Whitford wasn't just running. She was moving pieces. Jack looked out the diner window toward the north, where the tracks cut through the fields. Somewhere in the distance, a low hum bled into the cold air. Shadow heard it too. His ears angled forward, eyes locked on a point only he could see. The message was clear. The clock was running. By late afternoon, the barn loomed in the gray like it had been waiting for them. Jack returned with 2 deputies, a crime scene tech from the state, and a medic crew on standby. The air smelled like rain pressing down on the fields, ready to break. Shadow jumped from the cruiser before Jack had the leash fully in hand. The shepherd's tail was low, his head sweeping side to side as he took in the scent of the place. Then, without hesitation, he crossed the barn threshold and moved toward the far wall. Not the same spot as before, but a few feet over, where the floorboards looked slightly different. Jack crouched. The planks here were newer, the grain too clean for a building this old. "You've been busy, Helen," he muttered under his breath. Shadow's nose touched the seam between 2 boards. He gave 3 sharp barks, each one ricocheting off the rafters like an order. The sound had weight. "Mark it," Jack told the technician. He pulled the crowbar from his belt and drove it into the gap. The first board came up with a groan. Beneath was a second layer, narrower planks nailed across an opening. When those came free, cold, damp air rose in a slow, steady stream. The beam from Jack's flashlight caught stone steps dropping into darkness. The walls below were slick with moisture. "I'll go first," Jack said. Shadow was already on the stairs, paws silent on the wet stone. His ears twitched, his breathing slow and measured. Jack followed, his own boots slipping slightly on the moss-slick steps. The sound of water dripping echoed somewhere ahead. The stairwell spilled into a cramped chamber, then opened into a tunnel that ran like a scar under the earth. The ceiling was low enough that Jack had to hunch. The air was heavier here, metallic and stale. Shadow stopped, head turning sharply toward a sound only he could hear. Then he moved forward at a trot, the leash pulling tight. They rounded a bend and Jack's light hit a shape, then another. Figures, small, huddled. Chain links rattled in the beam. 12 children, barefoot, their clothes in tatters, skin pale and eyes wide. Each was shackled to a bolt in the wall, the chains short enough to keep them seated on the damp ground. The smell of urine and mildew hung in the air, almost masking the faint scent of rot. Shadow approached the nearest child slowly, lowering himself until he was almost crawling, tail sweeping once across the ground. The boy flinched at first, then reached out and touched the shepherd's fur. Shadow stayed still, letting the boy's hand rest there. "Get the medics in here now." Jack's voice was sharp, but his throat felt tight. The deputies moved fast, calling up the stairs. Boots clattered as rescuers descended with bolt cutters, blankets, and first aid kits. The sound of chains snapping filled the tunnel. Some kids cried openly, others just stared, silent, too drained to react. The rain broke above, pounding the earth hard enough to make the tunnel vibrate. Water began to trickle down the stone walls. One girl whimpered at the sound, curling into herself. Shadow moved closer, pressing his body against her until her shaking eased. Jack knelt beside a boy whose lips were cracked and bleeding. "You're safe now," he said, though he knew safety was still a long road away. The boy's eyes shifted past him to Shadow, then back, and he gave the smallest nod. One by one, the children were carried or guided up the stairs into the storm. The medics worked under the cover of tarps, wrapping them in blankets, checking pulses, starting IVs. The rain made everything harder. Slick ground, muddy wheels, hands slipping on wet metal, but no one stopped moving. Shadow emerged from the tunnel last, his coat wet and dark, his gaze still sweeping the yard as though counting the rescued. Jack put a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur. They had found 12 lives, in the dark, pulled them out into a storm that, for once, felt like it might wash something clean. But Jack knew from the look in Shadow's eyes that the barn still had more to give up. By sunrise the next day, Cedar Valley was no longer just a county matter. Black SUVs rolled into town, men and women in dark jackets stepping out with clipboards and cases. The FBI had taken over the command post in the high school gym, maps and photos taped to the walls. One lead kept circling back, a name buried in state medical grant records, linked to Whitford's so-called charity. Dr. Richard Hale, a respected rural physician, practicing 5 miles out on County Road 12. The convoy reached Hale's property just after noon. His house sat behind a stand of oaks, white clapboard, wrap-around porch. It looked harmless. But Shadow's reaction wasn't. The shepherd's head snapped toward the side of the house before the agents even reached the door. His tail lowered, hackles lifting. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sour. Hale wasn't home. Rooms were neat, staged almost. It was Shadow who found the truth. He stopped at a corner of the kitchen, nose pressed to the floor vent. A low whine slipped from him, the kind he used when scent met memory. "Mark it," Jack said. 2 agents pulled the vent cover free. Behind it was a recessed latch, hidden under a layer of dust. The panel in the pantry wall swung open to a narrow stairwell descending into dark. The basement wasn't a basement. It was a lab. Concrete walls, metal shelving lined with vials, syringes, and surgical tools laid out with precision. Filing cabinets ran along one wall. Jack yanked one open. Folders, each labeled with initials, ages, medical notes. An agent slid a manila file across the table to Jack. His gut clenched before he even opened it. Inside, a photo of Sophie Lane, school portrait from last year. Below it, subject, Lane, Sophie, age 10, transfer, pending, status, hold, location, alternative. Sight B Shadow stood beside him, eyes fixed on the folder, then looked toward the stairs, ears pricked forward as if he already knew where the trail needed to go next. Jack closed the file. "She's still out there," he said, and the room seemed to tighten around the words. The abandoned rail yard sat at the edge of the county like a scar. Rusted tracks, a leaning signal tower, weeds clawing through cracked pavement. The freight spur here hadn't been in use for years, at least not officially. Shadow jumped from the SUV before Jack had the door open. The shepherd's nose cut through the damp night air, head turning toward a single darkened boxcar near the end of the line. His body went still, tail low, muscles tight. FBI agents moved in on either flank, weapons ready. Jack followed Shadow, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. From inside the boxcar came a dull thump, then a muffled cry. "Federal agents, open up!" One of the agents barked. "No," answer, then the sharp crack of gunfire from inside. Splinters burst from the wooden slats. The agents returned fire, covering the open side door. Shadow didn't wait for permission. He launched himself up into the boxcar, vanishing into the dark. A shout erupted, followed by the sound of a struggle. Jack climbed in behind him. The flashlight beam cut through dust and shadows, finding Shadow locked onto the gun arm of a man in a black jacket. The weapon clattered to the floor. Shadow held him down, teeth bared, the deep rumble in his chest daring him to move. In the corner, wooden crates were stacked too high, air holes drilled in the sides. Jack kicked one open. Inside, a boy about 8, eyes wide, wrists bound. He stumbled into Jack's arms, gasping for air. Another crate broke open under an agent's crowbar. Sophie Lane spilled out, pale but conscious. She looked straight at Shadow, and her face changed from terror to something else entirely. By the time the boxcar was cleared, 8 children had been pulled from the crates. Combined with those from the barn, the count reached 20. Medics swarmed in, wrapping blankets around small shoulders, checking pulses, starting IVs. Shadow stepped back into the open air, coat dusted with sawdust, eyes scanning the yard. He wasn't watching for applause. He was making sure no one had been left behind. Jack looked at him and knew the truth. Without the dog, they would have been too late. Helen Whitford's arrest came quietly. No dramatic chase, no last stand. She was found sitting in a church pew 3 counties away, a Bible in her lap, telling the women's ministry she'd just moved from Charleston. By the next morning, she was shackled in the back of a federal transport van, heading to face charges alongside Dr. Richard Hale. The trial was moved to the federal courthouse in Lexington. Security was tight, metal detectors, armed marshals, plainclothes agents in the gallery. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the way rooms do when lives are about to be weighed. Sophie Lane took the stand on the second day. She was small against the vast oak witness box, her feet not touching the floor. She clutched a worn stuffed dog in one hand, the other gripping the rail. Her voice was soft at first, but steady. She told them about the cold in the basement, how the chains cut her skin, how the sound of the train whistle meant children would disappear. She spoke of Helen's voice above the trap door, telling them to be good, be quiet, just before someone came for them. In the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously. Jack sat near the aisle, every muscle taut. He didn't look at Helen or Hale. He kept his eyes on Sophie, willing her to see only one friendly face in the room. Outside, Shadow waited under the shade of an elm tree by the courthouse steps. Cameras turned his way, lenses snapping, but he didn't care. He lay with his head on his paws, ears flicking at each sound from inside. as if he could catch Sophie's words through the walls. When the verdict came, the room was silent except for the clerk's voice. Guilty, on all counts. Multiple life sentences without parole for both defendants. Helen stared straight ahead, her expression fixed. Hale shifted in his chair, jaw tight. Jack exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He stepped outside into the bright afternoon. Shadow rose to meet him, and for the first time in weeks, Jack let his hand rest on the dog's head without urgency. "It's over," he said. But they both knew it wasn't. Not really. Spring came to Cedar Valley with green pushing through the soil where the old Whitford barn once stood. The ground had been turned and planted, the smell of fresh earth replacing the rot and dust. In its center grew the community garden, tended by townspeople who had once walked past this place without knowing what lay beneath. At the far end, under the shade of a young oak, stood a bronze statue, a boy reaching toward a shaft of light, his fingers just brushing it. At his feet was a single paw print cast in bronze. Shadow's. On the day of the dedication, the crowd was quiet as Jack stepped to the microphone. Shadow sat beside him, gray now along his muzzle, but still with that steady, watchful gaze. Jack held a small medal in his hand, the one the Department of Justice had sent. He didn't follow orders blindly, Jack told them. He followed pain, and he never got it wrong. He placed the medal around Shadow's neck. The dog didn't shift under the weight. He just looked out over the garden as if making sure it stayed safe. The years that followed were softer. Shadow's hips slowed, but every morning he padded into the station, settling by the front desk to watch the door. Sometimes Jack would find him outside, lying in the grass near the garden, ears turning in the wind like he was still listening for what others couldn't hear. People brought their kids to see the statue. They told the story of the boy in bronze and the paw print beside him, of the dog who wouldn't move from a barn door because he knew someone still needed saving. Some left flowers, others left tennis balls. One little girl left a note. "Thank you for hearing me." When Shadow finally passed, they buried him at the edge of the garden, beneath the oak. The town turned out, not for a parade, but for the kind of silence that says more than speeches. Cedar Valley didn't forget, and neither should we. If this story moved you, if it reminded you what loyalty and courage can look like in 4 legs and a steady gaze, join us at German Shepherd. We share the true and inspired stories of dogs like Shadow, dogs who change lives, who listen when no one else will. Because sometimes the greatest heroes never say a word. What's your story with a loyal pet?